Hi again. I'm talking about the making a group purchase with a getting together with any number of people. Uh, I'm going to use the number 100. 100 is big enough to really make it worthwhile. I think for most watch companies, they won't want a specialized specific watch. Uh, on the other hand, 100 people, we sort of have to work out a way to coordinate that purchase. Now, there are a lot of different ways. There's this one company that was mentioned in the video on Friday that is called Develop Your Watch, and basically, what you can do, you say, we want this, we want this, we want that, and he takes care of everything else. That's a very, very easy way to organize things. Basically, you get an idea of what you want, and then you talk with the guy's name is Miguel, really a cool guy, and have him do it for you. Now, another way to do it, and this is what we did with Larique, we we had sort of an organization. Um, Not in your typical way. We had sort of a loose group that was totally dependent on consensus. Um, but let me tell you how it was organized, and this is sort of an unusual organization since it came down to uh, pretty much one person in one sense, but it was a group in another sense. Uh, Let me explain that. We had a watch. We had one watch company that we were starting with for the movement, Zaganor, and I did the contact with it. I had contacted them over the years on different issues. A group of us a year before we had started had sort of tried to get something going, and it was in the middle of a pandemic, and it was just too much. And so we thought, look, we'll give it a year. And then we came back in a year, and we had sort of the organized, non organized aspects of it. And let me explain why it seemed to work out. A number of reasons. We started off, we organized it around a Facebook page called Pure Horology. And part of that was a flow over from the High Horology Lounge. And Pure Horology is sort of refer to it as an incubator kind of place where people can get together and they can say, hey, let's a bunch of us get together and let's get this. Um, so we finally decided. We started actually negotiating with Aganor, and by negotiating, it was something that they could do, we could afford, and that we really wanted, and they wanted to do. And we started. I think we were hoping that we could get 20 people, and this was a big favor from Aganor because you're not going to make a lot. I mean, because you got staff to pay and everything else with helping these guys out with 20 people. But we eventually ended up with 51 people and the and 70 watches. Now that was because the 51 people, some people wanted more than one watch, and it turned out that some of the people who were buying, who were helping develop the watch, liked it so much they wanted to buy one too. Very unusual, but sort of a fun thing to happen. Okay, so organizationally, the way we ran things, or it was run, like I said, the core to it was the concept of consensus. What we did to really make it work, though, I think, was that we had good and constant communication. We had a number of different kinds of communication. First of all, we had WhatsApp, which is very important because there were a lot of things that were had to be done without in sort of some amount of privacy. And WhatsApp has encryption, so it's really hard for anyone to break in there and find out what you're up to. Now we had to deal with a lot of financial matters, and we could discuss that. And I could, when I got an invoice, I'd pay it, and then send everybody a copy of the invoice and the payment. And so that this way we could see how the project was moving forward. If it weren't for the invoices, you really wondered where everything was. And the I ended up doing sort of coordinating and being the banker, and it was hard to do it another way. But organizationally, it would have been great because I'm not a banker. Was to have somebody else do the banking, and then one other person coordinate it. Now, why you say one? Well, you have to bring together, and this is what I found out. If you have someone who can put pieces together, and I had dealt with in publishing for a long time, you got just all of these different levels of editors and pages and just all kinds of stuff that you have to deal with. And so I understood it in terms of dealing with publishing companies. Anybody who's dealt with sort of a project management or something like that, I think would be helpful to have on board. And why not have 2 or 3 people do it? Well, you could, but it would be tricky. I mean, I'd rather have someone else do it other than me, and that would have been fine. But I do think that the way it worked best was a single coordinator, and I think it'd even work better with a single coordinator and a banker. And so what the banker would do, the coordinator would send the banker the invoice. The banker would collect from the subscribers, and then we'd go forward from there. And we did that, except the banker and the coordinator were the same person, and the banker really wasn't a real banker. He was some guy who ended up doing it. That was something I learned a lot about. When you have 50 people, or actually looking at it as 65 watches, and they're about ending up around $8,000 a piece, that adds up a lot. And so what I had done was pretty much, I had this little business account, and so I pretty much turned it over to using for the project. And after a while, I realized that the only money going in there was for the project. Anything of my own, I just put it in a savings account or somewhere. But it turned out to be a good thing in this regard. One of the big expenses, at one time we had spent $1,600 in transfer fees just on the incoming to my bank. And this was early on, and but the amount of money that was accumulated was getting up there. So my bank, bless their heart, decided, well, this guy looks like he's got a lot of money. Let's give him all the perks. We're going to make him a premium member. So that's what my bank did. And one of the perks was that we didn't have the transfer fees. What they did, they added an additional $15 on getting it. Now the guy sending it, they had to pay some kind of fee. If you're in the United States, there's one kind of way to do it. I'm trying to think of the name of it. Right off the top of my head, I can't. But it turned out to be the most efficient way. Then when my bank said, okay, you don't have to collect, we're not going to charge you for a transfer fee, that made a whole lot of difference because then the fees weren't so bad. We had an international group, though. We had people from all over the world. And a lot of the guys in Asia were using this system called WISE, I think WISE, and it was slower, but it was fine. It worked great, and they didn't have the transfer fees as high. Some banks, some people's own bank, they had terrible transfer fees. Now, in addition to that, there was a conversion fee, a money conversion fee. Everything went into my bank as U.S. dollars, and I had asked everyone to send it as U.S. dollars. When I paid out a bill, it all went out as Swiss francs, except one company. When we got our packages, we got these pouches instead of regular hard cases, and the packages were these really nice leather pouches. And apparently, but it was from a Swiss company. They made them. They shipped a sample, looked at them. When we were invoiced for it, it was a bank they had in Florida, and so apparently, I guess they had one in Switzerland and also one in the United States. Those things happen, and the thing that worked the best, and this may sound funny, a lot of people say, "Well, let's use PayPal. Let's use PayPal," and I said no because I knew PayPal would be charging us every time something came in. They would be some kind of charge, and I was trying to avoid any further charges. The thing that ended up working best was a straight transfer, and when they stopped having the transfer fee, it it was it was the best. It worked out the best for us. So that was one thing that you have to consider. I mean, if you're dealing with 10 people, that's one thing. You're dealing with 50, it's another. If you're dealing with 100, it's still another. And I figured that's as far as I'd want to go. Let me also say about in terms of collecting money and so forth, I did it wrong. I had all these, as soon as we'd get sort of something, oh, so and so is going to charge us this much, we'd have an invoice. I'd say, okay, we got to pay this, so send this in. It was really a stupid way to do things because you ended up with more transfers, and with every transfer, the person transferring had to pay a transfer fee. So that wasn't a very smart way to do it. What I would suggest for future things is to have about half of it up front, because you're going to have all kinds of development fees and things like that on the front end. And so have trying to get a really good amount, I mean, a good prediction of what it's going to cost. You're going to know more after you go through it once, but even before you do that, try to find out, contact all the vendors you're going to be dealing with. If you're dealing with one, like if you're dealing with a watch company, easy peasy. If you're if you're dealing with all of these different, like we had the movement, we were dealing with Aganor. We had a case company with Butenlanen and Catton. We had all of these different vendors. Then we had our designer. Now this is something we didn't even think about. But it turned out to be one of the most valuable assets in the whole project, because he did more than just do a design for us. He helped coordinate getting the right dial with the case and the hand, all of that kind of stuff. Especially when you're building a bespoke watch, a good designer is worth their weight in gold. So that was one of the things that we were very fortunate about. Organizationally, though, I think what we did with organization is very modern, I suppose. We did it through the WhatsApp. We had a sort of a group WhatsApp, and if you wanted to say something, you'd say it through that. And then we also had a Facebook page. Some people had one or the other, some had both. I had both, fortunately. And so we had the Pure Horology Facebook page, but what would happen, we were concerned about, if we started working on that Pure Horology page, we'd get all these, kibitzer, people, oh, you ought to do this, and you ought to do that. And what we wanted to do was just have the people involved in the project on their own separate page. So we set up what we call the 6801 page, which is the name of our movement. Now, what this meant was that the only people there were the people who were in the project, which, in their commitment, they had been committing X amount of dollars. So we didn't have somebody coming in making noise. And you know how watch collectors are. They all think they're experts on everything. Some of them are, but you never know which ones until it's too late. So having a separate page for the people who are actually involved in the collaboration is very important. Now we had two separate pages, one on WhatsApp and then one on Facebook. It was funny. There was one guy, I mean, a very respectable gentleman, who for some reason got banned from WhatsApp. I guess he said something to somebody that got mad at him and kicked him off, and so he couldn't do that. And I know people get kicked off of Facebook pages all the time, so that's something. But what we had by having sort of this uh, almost like a bubble that we could work in was really very very helpful, and people could, on the pure horology page, when they were thinking about doing something, we gave people a long time, several weeks, to say, okay, you want in, do you want in, and finally, it was sort of put up or shut up, and then that was what we did, and we closed the door, and then we had the 6801 group, and here we could talk about it and plan and do different things sort of going along. So it wasn't a matter of one person, myself, a coordinator, telling everybody what to do or what we had to do. The coordinator works, we're all working for each other. I think that was important. You have somebody who thinks they're the boss. We had 50 people who thought they were the boss. That's okay, but we did work with consensus, and I think the other thing was that it's extremely important. The more knowledge that all the members have, I think the better they can understand the process of what's going on. Because some people say, well, can we do this? And it was just sounded like a little bitty thing, but it wasn't, and they didn't know that. And that's okay, because that's one thing, we all learned a ton of stuff. By the way, if any of you get involved in one of these collaborations, you're going to learn stuff that you never thought existed. Okay. Now, we also did this with all these people from all over the world. I mean, my God, we should have been the UN. I mean, we did have disagreements. We had one guy who was upset with something and left, but that's one out of 50, actually 51, on these things. And he had for him, he had a good reason. And, and I tried to say, let's, so he, maybe later on we'll do something together. He really preferred a much smaller group to work with. And that's one thing that would, no matter how you organize it, you've got to realize that you got to work toward consensus all the time. It doesn't just happen, and you have to be able to. Somebody wants this and somebody wants the opposite. You've got to figure out a common place, common ground that you're both only a little unhappy, rather than somebody is, turn purple. And a lot of the things I did not want at all, I've come to love. So you can learn a lot from other people. And again, you work with consensus, and that's as an organizational concept. Now, someone may say, "Well, that's not organizational concept." Well, I think they'd be wrong. I think it would be. I think it's a very important one. As opposed, now there's sort of a democratic thing, and the reason we didn't have democratic in the sense that, well, you either have red or blue, and if people, red or blue is not, I'll say green or purple, okay, so you either choose green or purple, and if 49% of the people wanted green and they hated purple, and 51% of the people loved purple, and they didn't care for green, well, that means that 49% of people are going to be unhappy. And that's why consistency is important. And so instead of having purple and green, you may end up with, orange, something like that. Or either that, or people would come around to it. They had this one guy who said he wanted purple hands. That was it. And we talked about purple hands, and they ended up being burgundy. Now, nobody had said they wanted burgundy hands or wine-colored hands. A lot of people, they didn't want to have purple hands, but we all loved wine-colored, and they wouldn't have come up had the guy not said, well, how about purple hands? And, well, it turned out. And so things can work out. If you've got to have people who aren't going to hold their breath until they get their own way. If you do, you're going to have problems. Excuse me. So organizationally, it was One, that it was organized around the 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 web pages, the Facebook pages, and the WhatsApp page. That's where we did the communication. Uh, the other thing, the part of the role of a coordinator, is really to keep everybody up to speed. Same with the banker. Um, and like I said, I think those would be great to have separate roles for that, because both of them are take a lot of work, and you have to be very attentive to details in coordinating. And I remember in book publishing, they had an editor for every step of the way. You start with an acquisition editor, then you go with a development editor, and then a copy editor, a managing editor, and they all did these different things in order to have a book. Now, things have changed a lot since, since I wrote my first book on a typewriter, which nobody should have to do. But the thing of it is that the way the flow, the workflow, and so forth went is something you. That's one type of organization. Now, some other organizations I've seen in like the collective, they seem to have a much tighter organization, and they have certain criteria for who can come in and who can't. And they have application process, I think, and you go there to sign up, and they both of them. I'm not sure how they actually contact a watch company. For example, I think the one that I liked a lot was the H. Moser, that I think it was the collective did that one, and they got together somehow with H. Moser, and they wanted the dial of one watch and the case of another, and sort of, and they ended up with and then they wanted a bezel on top of the whole thing that neither one of them had, a rotating bezel, sort of making a sports watch out of sport-ish watches. Interesting process, but I don't know how they went about that. I don't know whether they had a team that went in and they talked to H. Moser and say, this is what we'd like. I don't know whether they had done that in Europe, or they had done it elsewhere like we have. It's so they have another kind of organization. What I'm saying is, I don't know what it is, but it was probably not the same thing we had. Um, so it's something that's not impossible, but it can be difficult. And I think the the big, like I said, you have to have people at the outset to say, look, you guys, if you run into something that you absolutely hate, let's hear about it, and let's talk about it, and let's see if we can get into a consensus. That's why the example of Purple Hands is such a one that worked out so well for all of us. It went from most people hating the idea to all of us liking it, but it was instead of purple, it was like a burgundy. It was a wine color, and these kinds of things. And I think that attitude. No one can hold their breath or think they're a genius. Okay, and the people that were in our group were very smart people. Believe me, they're smart. They weren't, but it's something that I think can work. Another thing, like I mentioned at the outset, is develop your watch. There's a guy who will take care of everything for you, and basically you just make the payment, get it done, and waiting for your watch to get done. That's another way to do it. I think you're the if you have a better division of labor. We had a little, for example, one thing that we could do without having to coordinate 50 other things was the case we were going to get. And so we had another guy go out and he checked everything, came back with a perfect case for us, and we all liked it, and so we got it. And that was one thing that I didn't have to worry about, except for making the payments, and that worked out okay. So if there's something that you can do that with, I think another area that you don't need the close coordination on would be the strap and the buckle. As long as you know the lug width, That's from the case. You can have a person go and deal with that um, without having to worry about, is this going to fit with all of these other things. The most difficult part is coordinating the movement with the case with the dial. Um, and to some extent the hands would go along with that, but you if any one of those things other than the hands, you can have a lot of different kinds of hands, and as long as they fit on the posts that they have for them, everything is okay. But like little things that I never thought of before, we had talked about having we had lacquer hands. The reason we had lacquer, we wanted lacquer, at least I did. Some people didn't, but that was what Philippe Dufour had used on the Simplicity 37. Now, it wasn't. It was. He simply pointed to saying, "Look at Metal M did this." That's the name of the uh, dial maker. Well, a dial, the thickness of it is very important. And so what do I know about that? I have to get that stuff together. The kind of technical drawings you needed for a case that fit the movement. All of this stuff has to be done, and you need somebody who understands that. That's like I said, we had our designer do that. He would render all of this kind of technical drawings and hand it over to the work with the movement maker and the other part. So you have organizationally, I think one of the things that becomes important is to let the organization that exists and the connections that exist in our case in Switzerland, it was almost all Geneva, let them do it. I mean, for God's sakes, the last thing you want to do is interject into their work. That was another thing I think that really helped us a lot. Um, our designer's name was Matu. And so we'd get together, we'd be talking about some. We finally said, well, what does Matu say? What would he suggest? And, we'd listen to him. And that is so important, is realizing that, somebody comes up with an idea and we're not sure about it. And then if we had our own idea, we'd go to Matthew and say, hey, this is what we're thinking about, like we ended up doing with the burgundy colored hands. And he helped us get the burgundy, and then it turned out that the burgundy on the hands was a different Pantone number than was on the, all kinds of little things like that you got to pay attention to. And for the most part, what you want to do is you want to let the coordination that exists and understanding that. For example, Agenhor knew who to contact at the. Well, I would talk to the guy. I talked to both of them. The people at Butenland and Caton who are doing the cases. I would say, well, we're doing the movement with Agenhor, and so I put them in the contact, and they usually knew each other already, so it wasn't like a whole lot. But if you're all of these pieces, you have to sort of put up there. And so it's like, here's a bunch of Legos, guys. These are the Legos we want, and they knew how to put it together. They're sort of with all these different parts, and so that kind of organization worked. Now I don't know whether that would work with everybody, or whether or not that's the best organization. All I can say is it worked for us. Sometimes, if you don't know anything at all, going with something like Develop Your Watch, I think, is a good idea. Or with Vaucheur, you could, get 25 people together and say, look, the organization would be simply letting their organization handle everything for you. So you can first get together, you can look at the kinds of movements that they have, and they got a lot of different kinds of, there's probably 2 or 3 bases maybe, and then they have all kinds of combination on those bases. And so you can get together with people and say, hey, let's make a watch using Vaucheur. You can use Vaucheur for the movement. You can use Vaucheur for the cases, I believe. I don't know about the dial. I imagine they do the dial too. The one that I have when it was sent, it included the dial on there, sort of a sample dial with different holes in it, and apparently they could put it on all of their different kinds of movements, and it would have a little window for a date. They'd have one at 3 o'clock, one at 4:30 to show you. Then you could get your either from them or somewhere else get it. They may also have hands as well. So these are some of the things. Now, let's say that you don't like the cases that they have, Vaucher has, and so you'd want to go to somewhere else and to get a case from one of the other case makers, like we did with Voutilant and Caton. There are all kinds of things, and I think the important thing there is to talk. With each other, the other guys and gals. We had one gal with her. She was sort of stealth in the whole thing, and but listen to everyone. That was a big thing. What about this? What about that? And so forth. And then that sounds like, boy, that's really loosey goosey. But I mean, with people from all over the world. Man, I tell you, also too, most of the communication that I did with the certain developers, they just wanted to speak French, and that was fine with me. Google French worked great. They would send an email, I would open up my translator, read it, write it up in English, have it translated into French, and send it back. That worked great. I mean, it was one of the things you become used to, especially in Switzerland, where they speak the French part around, especially around Geneva. Most of it's French, but there's a German part and there's an Italian part. And there's another one. I think it's sort of Romanesque. It's Portuguese, right? It seems to be a large Portuguese population there, but fortunately. Most people spoke English, but sometimes they weren't comfortable in it, and so I had no problem going back and forth in French, and I did that a lot. And I think there was one place I had to talk with somebody in German, and it was the same thing, just use Google Translate, and back and forth, we had no problem with that. But anyway, so when you're getting ready, you need to have an organizational plan. It can be you could set up a hierarchy with a president and vice president, and all sort of straight up hierarchy, or you can have something a little more flexible, a little looser, or somewhere in between. But you got to figure something out so everything will work together. And I think probably the most important thing is coming up with some kind of here's our attitude. We're going to be this kind of group. So anyway, now on Sunday at 4 o'clock, we're going to have the live show. I couldn't have it. We got grandkids here, and I thought, well, I better record it so I don't have to tell them, get out of here, I'm recording, something like that. So that's what I thought, well, I'll have this recorded. This is the 4 o'clock Saturday, where we usually have a live streaming. We'll have it at Sunday at 4, but this is the topic we're going to talk about. Everybody take care. Hope to see you then. Bye for now.